Hi, I'm Vere van Gool. I'm a curator and a researcher and a writer based in New York, where I run the Idea City program at the New Museum for Contemporary Art in Manhattan on the Bowery. Idea City is a program that looks at art and culture outside of the walls of the city, and we recently culminated a program in Singapore, which is, I think, the 12th of our programs internationally throughout the last decade. And we basically operate as a residency and a public program and kind of every other alternative art format that you can possibly imagine in between, from radio shows to demos to daily newspaper prints, etc. And I've been at the museum for about 4.5 years, and it's been a really exciting time to see how an art program can respond to, I guess, the current changing times, specifically being in the US as a European. I'm born and raised in Amsterdam, spent a lot of time in London where I went to school in England, and then moved to the US, and literally saw from an Obama administration to a Trump administration, the art and cultural world change, and then translating that through Idea City at the museum internationally has been a really exciting and complex journey, which also brings us to this conversation here. So thank you for taking the time to speak to me. New York is facing a very complex time in its history with the current pandemic. The city has been in lockdown for about, I would say, 6 weeks, which is very complex for a city that really prides itself as an international metropolis that brings together, 20 million people a day. And New York literally branded itself as, the busiest city on earth. And all of a sudden, people have disappeared, gone to their country houses or left the country or gone to friends. But basically, Manhattan as an island is a complete version of Gotham City. There's been an exodus that I have never ever seen in my life, where you walk around the streets and you see nobody during 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 2 p.m., 6 p.m., and quite frankly, late at night, it turns dark. And that's because America, and specifically cities like New York, where there's such a gap between rich and poor, the visuals of those are filtered out when you see a lot of young urban people walk around, go about their business, and kind of, level away a lot of the insecurities and discrepancies in wealth and care that are fundamental to America as a country, but specifically in New York. So when you bike through Wall Street, and biking is something that I do now to kind of keep busy and to see what's going on, you literally see the fanciest of business buildings that you can kind of imagine in Singapore, and just a ton of homeless people outside camping out. And it's very complex, because I think we're faced with a reality that a lot of us pretended didn't exist. So it's eye-opening. But also for a lot of New Yorkers and the New York identity of walking into an elevator, being, chit-chatting, hey, how you doing? You have nobody to talk to. There's nothing to do. The gazillion restaurants, museums, galleries, everything is closed. And it really asks a question to you as a person: why are you there? Why are you submitting to this ridiculous industry of paying thousands of dollars of rent to live in a tiny apartment like myself in what is supposed to be the greatest city on earth? But the moment you take people away and you take functions of togetherness away, there is a very grim scenario left. That is kind of the urban reading of it. I think on a healthcare level, it's below par. It's a very dire situation in which cases are growing and growing. Still today, testing is below the numbers of where it should be. And what you see now is when the kind of first wave has hit, and maybe it's similar to Singapore in a way that the first wave hit everybody, so to say. The second wave is going to hit basically people that live in very dense buildings and areas, and that is in the US, in New York specifically, typically brown and black minority groups. And that's something that as a city, as American culture, that's a conversation that nobody's prepared for, and nobody has the tools to address, and even to address it, and let alone come up with a solution and come up with a healthcare procedure that makes sure that COVID isn't going to wipe out more people, so to say, than it already did unnecessarily. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. It's also a very strange feeling. There's a cop car at every corner of the street, and that's not a joke. When I bike or when I'm in a car, I got pulled over 3 or 4 times over nothing, and it's because there's such a police culture. Nobody has anything to do, and they're just going to bug you. So I wouldn't say it's recommendable, but it's a very good insight into what actually New York is and already was. We just weren't really looking for it. The art world is affected in so many ways. First of all, globally, we're not really able right now to see what the scope of this economic crash actually entails. It's gonna be major. We have no references, but the crash of the 1930s to compare it to using American jargon. So any financial crash will outplay itself in the art market. It actually being, a leisure and luxury market if you sum it down to it, in a dystopian way. I think that's an important trend to see. What you then kind of can encounter is that less people are going to give money to museums, to institutions, and less people are going to buy art. There will be more trading of secondary markets, so items that have already been bought, but less people are looking at first market buying work from new artists or new work from artists, so to say. So that's the kind of larger story around it. Then I think the question specifically with regards to museums, like the new museum, is very complicated because you build a business model around audiences, and all of a sudden the one thing, the kind of the raison d'etre of why you have a museum is taken away, and what is left? And you find yourself with an empty building that you can't even adapt to house homeless people, or run a school program because you don't have the right coding for it, you don't have the right healthcare system in place to even allow people to keep their distance. And what that means is that the role of the museum as this, kind of, I don't know, this like sanctuary almost for people, and this safe place where you can learn and see different cultures, have now become a little useless. A lot of square footage in New York, from the Met to the MoMA to the thousands of galleries, cultural spaces, are literally empty, not doing anything. And with so many museum expansions, including the new museum coming up in 2021 or 2022, the question really comes for museums, curators, and artists themselves: what is the role of art if you don't have audiences? What is the role of art when you don't have space? And how can you come up with a more, I would say, a more adaptable version of the static museum that fits today's trends? We know this pandemic is not going to be the last one. So how can we design and curate systems that actually allow for these larger crises, whether it's now a pandemic or the next economic crash, or we'll have something else? We all know something else is going to happen. How can we design our coming together and our transfer and exchange of culture better? That's a larger question. I think in a day-to-day, it's just very complicated to run a business model in which your main goal is taken away. But museums aren't different than restaurants. They aren't different that much than, bookstores. It's still a business. And I think this economic crash and the major layoffs you've seen specifically in capitalist countries like the US, where all of a sudden 2 weeks closure means that 100 people are going to be laid off, or 40% of the staff, really begs to wonder, are we running the right business models for museums? If we are these token of cultures and ethics and values, maybe we should really start defending our own people that spread that message on behalf of us, to make sure that they don't get laid off within 2 weeks of no audiences to see that miraculous art that they've curated or hung up on the walls, or even, secured. So I think it's both a reimagination of who we could be. It's understanding how even museums, no matter where you are in this world, are ultimately a response to the economic reality we're in. And then secondly, it's a wake up, or thirdly, it's a wake up call. What does it mean to be a museum? Are we a luxury market? Are we an educational service? Are we a very important point of international relations? I'm not sure. And I think a lot of museums and cultural institutions should redefine themselves according to those questions to stay relevant. If you can offer nothing in a global pandemic, what's your value? So, you know, you can send a newsletter and you can have your online show, and there are amazing examples of this, but what's really your value? How do you reach people? How do you connect? How can art still touch that untouchable desire or interest or curiosity that we all claim we do the moment that nobody can enter a museum? And I think the last point of that is we now speak of museums being closed because we can't open them because the governor said so or politics said so. But in the US, the ticket price of a museum is $22. So the museum is pretty closed for a lot of people throughout the entire year already. All of a sudden now we're talking about that nobody can come in, but you know, when you're from a middle or lower income family, you're not going to spend $22 on visiting, you know, 1,000 square foot with 3 abstract paintings space in it. So I think another version there is, you know, wow, okay, now we're closed, but maybe we were already always closed. It's just that now we're closed to a different category, and that's a category of power, of elitism, of press, of the entire top layer that keeps the art world functioning on its own. So again, it's like we have to take this as a moment to become better. We have to redesign who we are as museums. We have to be better curators, and we have to have more healthy and better and equitable relationships with people that want to see and learn and make art. I've been spending the last 2.5 years in between Singapore, Southeast Asia, and New York. And it's been a really wonderful experience for me to not just visit Southeast Asia and Singapore, but actually work in a place and collaborate, which brings a different understanding of where you are. With regards to Idea City Singapore, which was a collaboration between the NTU CCA Singapore and the New Museum, throughout these last 2 years, we, as kind of a program, had as our main priority to stimulate collaborations and networks and bring together people to learn and to share, I think, an entire dialogue across solidarity with nature, which was the theme in Southeast Asia. And all of a sudden, this sharing and this exchange during COVID was no longer on the table. When we were thinking about the format of Idea City, which in this case took place as a residency and public program, a key interest of mine was not to just talk about Southeast Asia in Singapore, but set up collaborations across Southeast Asia that could address the topic solidarity with nature, and specifically climate change and what our futures hold, so to say, in each place and in each small institution that we collaborated with in a unique way, rather than homogenizing the entire discourse. So what was really funny when you put the lens of COVID, and you know, we in Singapore, that meant we were there in early February, that you couldn't have gatherings from over 50 people, but museums could still open, restaurants were still open. We just had to be very, very careful, and there was a lot of social distancing and different protocols in place to enable our health. And what that meant is that all of a sudden you start seeing curation very differently. Typically, and you can see all the press photos, when you go to a museum, you see packed galleries and you see busy school tables and lecture halls filled with audiences, and all of a sudden that's gone. But what's the real value of what you do? And that's that smaller scale exchange. It's that one-on-one grassroots type of dialogue that I think throughout Idea City really came up as the most important part of it. So we were planning a kind of 3-part situation, a residency program in which 20 folks from Southeast Asia, Singapore, and a few internationals came together to learn and research and educate themselves on solidarity structures in Singapore and in Southeast Asia tied to their own research. Then we had a public convening that featured a lot of local artists from Ruan to Himan Chong to international voices like Emeka Ogba, Angela Dimayuga, Audrey Tang, you name it, to kind of zoom in and zoom out of what we did that entire residency in dialogue with the discourse of these cultural visionaries, so to say. And then the third part was a satellite program in which we collaborated with institutions across Southeast Asia to set up small scale initiatives that we asked a ton of small nonprofit independent organizations the question, what does solidarity mean for you and what does it mean within your institutional practice? And throughout this dialogue, so to say, we gathered a ton of research onto the regions about people and participants and organizations and issues that took place locally. And we did so in 5 countries, from Indonesia to Thailand to Vietnam to Kuala Lumpur to, I'm forgetting one, I'm so tired. This is terrible. I'll get back to that. It's been 2 months ago. And we've asked small nonprofits to see how we could help them ask that question to audiences. And what came up from that was a set of initiatives that first the New Museum as well as the CCA were like, why are you doing this? Why don't you just go there and fly them into Singapore? But part of my, I think, interest was not to create Singapore or highlight Singapore as this capital of Southeast Asia, but really use the power that Singapore has as one of the better funded areas in the region with a lot more resources and a much more vocal relationship to the West and across Asia, so to say, whether we agree with that or not, and highlight smaller independent narratives and projects. So what happened is we organized an archiving workshop with the Malaysia Design Archive that looked at archiving as a tool to counter censorship. We worked with the Land Foundation in Chiang Mai on a solar cooker workshop that looked at educating local farmer communities on how to cook themselves without electricity and simultaneously use medicinal recipes that are centuries old and kind of highlight them to a level of awareness today. We worked in Yogyakarta on a P2P design lab in which individual practitioners could come up with small-scale solutions that were based within collaboration to counter climate change in their daily lives. In Saigon, we collaborated with Sun Art and had a film screening for contemporary Vietnamese filmmakers who were addressing nature and climate change, which is really a sensitive topic in Vietnam. And we gave them a platform that wasn't just Sun Art, but all of a sudden it was resonated through the CCA in Singapore and through the New Museum. And then the last place that I just forgot to mention was in the Philippines, where we worked in Los Banos and basically created a 3-day camp in which we were educating folks on zomia, which is kind of a cultural condition above a certain altitude in which communities but also nature operates differently and what lessons could be learned there. So when COVID hit these 3 programs, so to say, because it really happened, we were all in Singapore and all of a sudden we got a notice that Code Orange was installed and we didn't really know what that meant. We have as Westerners, no real history in our lives to deal with a pandemic. We had to redesign the entire program. So first of all, that meant, okay, rather than learning from Singapore in its dense areas, we're gonna learn from a city remotely. What does that mean? And practically that was a really exciting journey in a way, because we had to relocate a lot of our programming, but became a lot more deliberate about why we are where we are. Maybe it is more interesting to do a walk through, kind of cultural hubs of Singapore at 2 a.m. because you see a very different version of what you see when you Google Singapore, so to say. Maybe it is better that we go on a Surviving the Sea workshop with Charles Lim at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, because that is a completely unique experience rather than on a Sunday afternoon when so many other people are enjoying the, may I say, ridiculous beaches that Singapore has many of. So using time and space and kind of abstracting what was normal into a COVID landscape created an entire new understanding of our built society and how we come together in that. For the public program, it meant that we basically changed our 8 hour of exciting performances, workshops, talks, dialogues, lectures, debates into shortly put a television show that was both live streamed in New York as well as globally, of course, and in Singapore for audiences at home. And it really asked us to reinterpret our content and reinterpret our conversations to not just fit those in the room. And sometimes you can record something, but it's really different as a curator to be thinking about how to position an artist's work when the entire world is watching. Some people are watching at 10 a.m., other people are watching at 10 p.m. So it was like, good morning, good evening. It was that type of mixture, and simultaneously still bring this sense of collaboration and inclusivity, that it wasn't just a lecture series, but it was dynamic and it was weird and it was unique through the lens of video. And I think that was a really exciting journey that, with the help of the CCA and my colleagues at the museum, really was kind of successfully done, partly because we've never done it before. There are no books written on it, so you just have to roll with your intuition and kind of become a performer. And I think everybody understood that. So almost I would say that the public conference of Idea City was the best one we've ever done, because those who could be in the room were feeling such an intimate shared space that the content that they delivered was so much better. And we were all aware we're not just talking to this academic crowd of museums, we're really talking to everybody right now. How do I reposition my research and my thinking and my art spiel, so to say? So it was an amazing filter. And then thirdly, for the satellite programs, because they were so grassroots or organized, they were so small, they were so meaningful in a way, but also across all these different regions, quite often in the countryside, as the place where best to observe nature and its erosion. They could all continue. None of those were designed to be amassing more than 50 people, and each country had their own COVID regulations, so to say. But it was all of a sudden the most decentralized approach that we've ever had as an Idea City, where we literally created so many different little programs at the same time across an entire region, that the power that this exchange had could still kind of remain intact and operates. And we'd cleverly designed for this program to kind of travel on Monday from the Philippines to Tuesday in Vietnam to Thursday in Malaysia and Friday in Thailand and Saturday in Indonesia. We kind of like traveled through. So it was exciting for us that even though the residency was adapted, our public program was adapted, there was still this third layer that was spread out, still operating and creating content. And I think that's another lesson for a lot of arts organizers, specifically in light of biennials. Maybe stop focusing on the one big bang and use your resources to spread it across evenly, to make sure that everybody that could do something amazing with your resources is doing something amazing. Because by far the budgets that we spend on collaborations and on transparency and on all of the satellite projects are less than a complex airline ticket to get somebody from South Germany to Singapore and house them for 2 nights. So if I were to choose as a curator next time around, am I going to fly all these people in, or am I going to take that budget and allocate it locally smartly in a way that we can actually create something with longevity? I might do that than the 3-day flying in of somebody. All sorts of problems that obviously this international art world brings along, all sorts of problems that Idea City has, but Singapore was a really big exercise for us to both do it really right for the first time ever in a way, but also still be reminded of our own mistakes. And yeah, I think it was a really transformative experience for us as organizers, for all the participants, most importantly, but also for the international network that we tapped. I felt that COVID has taken a lot of away from people, and we were in Singapore each day leading up to Idea City, doubting, should we continue, should we not continue? Keep in mind, it's an American museum with Singaporean museum. This pandemic had not yet hit the US yet, but they were very scared about anything that you can imagine, from one of our participants getting sick to lawsuits to the legal case of us even doing this in a foreign country with a code orange. That's just not the best looking thing on paper, but because the CCA and a lot of our local participants have had a lot of experience with previous, whether it's SARS or previous just kind of like larger interference to daily life, we felt confident that we could do it, and did so very consciously, from health checks to making sure nobody was really sharing a space with more than 20-25 people, even though the limit was 50. Yeah, I think it was a really interesting exercise, and afterwards a lot of folks locally and regionally said, I'm just so happy it continued, because COVID is also an excuse for a lot of museums and organizations and investors to just drop a project. And here we are working, looking forward to something, having changed our entire lives to make space for this, taken off time from work, and then you're just going to cancel it, huh? So I think in that best interest, we continued, but also with the notice, which I think is very important for all institutions to say, if you do not feel comfortable, please don't join, you'll still get paid. And I think that's an ethos that I'm very proud of that the new museum provided, because maybe it goes against some Singaporean rules to not pay somebody when they don't show up, but it is the right thing to do. It's a labor contract. You can't just because there's a pandemic and you have a 2-year-old baby, you don't feel comfortable to fly in and out of Asia because you might live somewhere where they have, rules and regulations of how to come back, to withhold promised income. Don't think that's fair. So that's the largest kind of summary of Idea City. It was really exciting to be at the substation and to hear you talk, and to see your tour of Bukit Brown, and those kind of, activities I think have shaped the thinking of a lot of our participants beyond just that smaller period in Singapore. And that's the purpose ultimately of Idea City. It's not about, a fantastic festival that brings together thousands of people. It's about longer collaborations between people from all over the world, between different disciplines, and meaningful exchange. And I think we did that. Yeah, thank you so much, Chen and the substation, for having this conversation. It's really good to talk about this because I left Southeast Asia and was thrown into a new reality of isolation and adapting myself to a complete new reality. And it's through these conversations that I kind of remember, oh, what did we actually do? Oh, wait, now I see it in a completely different light. So each of these conversations are important for me personally, but also in terms of the work that I do and such on. I think the saddest thing is I don't know when I can come back, because Singapore and its community has shaped me irreversibly, and it's become a home. I would often joke that, I went to school in London and I live in New York, but Singapore is like my third place. And now I'm like, wait, I literally don't know if I can come back within this year, which is a very strange reality. But in these conversations, I feel like I'm a little closer. So that's good. So thank you so much for having me and talking. And yeah, I hope we can all learn lessons from this program and its mistakes and its successes, so to say.